In this presentation, we will be covering the concepts of quantification. This presentation is supported by the IAEA Technical Cooperation POL9027 project, enhancing the capabilities of positron emission tomography departments to provide high-quality imaging and therapies to promote safety culture. These are the learning objectives for the presentation. Why should we quantify our nuclear medicine images? What forms of quantification are available to us? How do we quantify? What quantitative outputs can we get? What are the challenges of quantification in nuclear medicine? And finally, we'll discuss harmonization of approaches. So why should we quantify? A lot of nuclear medicine is based on visual interpretation of images, where the presence or absence of radiopharmaceutical gives us information to make a diagnosis. So, for example, in this ioflupane SPECT image, the absence of the radiopharmaceutical in striatal structures can help us determine whether the patient's physiology is in alignment with what would be expected in Parkinson's disease. Or in this gallium PSMA PET image, where uptake can tell us about the extent of the primary tumour and whether disease has metastasized or spread to the lymphatic system. This is perfectly adequate in that we do not necessarily need quantification, just the presence or absence of radiopharmaceutical. But let us now look at these examples. In DAT scan, or ioflupane SPECT imaging, we know that a normal scan shows uptake in the striatal structures, as we can see here. And in this abnormal scan, we will have areas without uptake, for example, bilaterally in the putamen in this particular example. But what about these two studies? In the image on the bottom left, there is reduced uptake on the right side. And in the study on the bottom right, the contrast between striata and background is reduced, which might indicate that the scan is abnormal. Quantification can help us in these challenging cases. Following quantification, we can compare our quantitative values with subjects known to have normal uptake to determine whether the scan is normal or not. And it can bring more consistency in reporting, with quantification supporting image interpretation. Having quantification comparisons to normal uptake can also allow novices to match the reporting accuracy of experts, as shown in these two papers for DAT scan and amyloid PET imaging. Here is another example. We have these pre and post therapy images that we've acquired using iodine 123 MIBG. Can we see if the iodine 131 MIBG therapy has made an impact on this patient? But if we add quantification, we can determine whether there has been a change or not in both the intensity and volume of uptake in our lesions. So quantification can assist us in disease monitoring. And here is a third example. Myocardial perfusion imaging is often assessed visually, but we can add value if we compare relative uptake in the myocardium to a normal population. And in another step, we can add another level of information, such as the addition of absolute blood flow values. So in this example, we've shown that quantification can provide supplementary information, and with this information, we can make comparisons to a healthy population to give us certainty on whether the patient has a condition that we have concern for or not. What forms of quantification are there? One form of quantification we perform is relative quantification, where we quantify uptake relative to a reference region, like the highest uptake region in myocardial perfusion imaging, or to an unaffected area of interest in neurological PET, such as the cerebellum. As we've mentioned in the previous slide, we can then compare our values to a normal database. The second form of quantification I want to consider is quantification in terms of activity concentration, such as that we might do in thyroid imaging, or in this quantitative SPECT example where we're quantifying absolute uptake within bone. So how do we quantify? We're going to consider absolute quantification here. We know that native acquisition of data in SPECT is counts, or in PET, events. And this is okay for relative quantification. But it's more useful to bring this metric in terms of activity concentration, which covers things like SUV and other metrics which we'll consider later. But to do this form of quantification, we need a calibration to convert our counts or events to activity. To calibrate for planar imaging, we fill a phantom with known activity, and we may choose this phantom to be clinically relevant, such as a neck phantom if we were performing quantification in thyroid imaging. We then scan this phantom with a protocol similar to what we would use clinically. And from this, we can derive a sensitivity calibration in terms of counts per second per megabecquerel of activity. This is then applied retrospectively to regions of interest counts for areas that we're interested in. Alternatively, we can use an imaging standard with a known amount of activity, which we place in our scanning field of view. We scan the patient and the standard at the same time, with a region on the standard giving a direct translation of activity in the region that we're actually interested in. For tomography, there are two methods that we can calibrate our system. For SPECT only, we can get a calibration by imaging a known activity in either a point or planar source. This assumes all the counts are correctly taken from the planar to SPECT acquisition. On Siemens systems, NIST sources can be purchased with activities directly traceable to a metrology measurement, which excludes some issues we might get with inaccuracies from our radionuclide calibrators. The alternative is to have a known activity in a cylindrical source. In PET, we always use a cylindrical source with known activity concentration to calibrate our scanners, and this is an approach that is also being used on some SPECT systems too. What we are doing with both these approaches is to acquire image data of known activity in known volume to derive a calibration of counts in SPECT or events from PET to activity. So how are these calibrations used? In 2D planar imaging, the calibration tends to be used in post-processing, whereas in 3D tomographic imaging like PET and SPECT, calibration is baked into the software so we can get outputs directly in terms of activity concentration. However, there are some issues for SPECT users with no real DICOM standard for storing such images, with manufacturers using their own version of a PET DICOM format. I want to spend a little time now talking about how we ensure that quantification on our scanners is accurate. When calibrating the scanner for quantitative imaging, we relate any scanner-measured activity to the activity measured in our radionuclide calibrator. Ideally, this radionuclide calibrator should have measurements traceable to a metrology lab to ensure that these measurements are accurate. However, it is known that this is challenging for many centres. Radionuclide calibrator measurements are always important to us in nuclear medicine because they help us record the activity as a surrogate of the dose that we give to the patient. But in radioligand therapy, the accuracy of these measurements becomes particularly important because it will help us determine the actual dose rate and therefore the dose that the patient receives. And while we're usually quite confident of measurements of diagnostic radionuclides such as technetium-99m, we're not always as confident with other radionuclides such as lutetium-177, yttrium-90 and iodine-131, and may also need to consider volume effects and container effects more too. In SUV, SPECT and PET, given the scan is calibrated to the radionuclide calibrator, any inaccuracy tends to cancel out. The key in this instance is the time difference between injection and imaging and the synchronization of clocks. Let's now talk about quantitative outputs from our scanner. There are lots of different types of quantification in nuclear medicine, some of which are highlighted here. We will investigate some of these in the coming minutes. Activity concentration is a starting point for many quantitative metrics such as kinetic analysis or measurement of SUV, but is also an important measure in its own right in the area of dosimetry, mainly for therapy, but also for diagnostics. In dosimetry, we need to determine the energy imparted in tissue. We can calculate this from knowledge of the radionuclide emissions from the radionuclide that we're using and its absorption, which we get from MERD-S values. And we multiply this by the activity concentration we measure in images over time. So with our activity concentration as a metric, what we can do is we can use our scanner calibration or the use of an imaging standard to derive imaging concentration in the feature that we're interested in at each time point. Or we can use a dose point kernel, which can convert activity in our image into dose rate. The purest form of quantifying physiological processes from our radiopharmaceuticals is through kinetic modelling. So kinetic modelling is going to quantify our radiopharmaceutical kinetics. This works by taking a measure of the influx of radiopharmaceutical in blood plasma, which we call the input function, to determine the pharmacokinetics of the radiopharmaceutical in organs and tissues. We mostly do this through compartmental modelling. And this method uses information on the activity concentration that we get from our images. Kinetic modelling can be difficult and time-consuming, often requiring arterial lines to get information of radiopharmaceutical in plasma, which we use as our input function. Instead, in routine clinical imaging, we use the measure of standardized uptake value, or SUV, which we regularly use in FDG imaging. But how is it defined? In the model that you see now, we have FDG in 3 states. It can either be free in plasma, it can be in tissue, or it can be metabolized in tissue. And we have these K values representing the transition between these 3 states. Now, assumptions that we use for FDG is that if we image 60 minutes or beyond after injection, then we can assume that K4 is negligible. And we can also assume that the amount of FDG that is not metabolized in tissue is also negligible. So this allows us to measure directly the metabolized FDG in tissue, so that if we place our region of interest around a feature of interest, we can say that we're measuring the glucose metabolism in that feature. Today, SUV is used for many radiopharmaceuticals in both PET and SPECT. But we should always remember that it has some assumptions that it's based on. That is, that we have negligible K4, i.e. transition from the metabolized radiopharmaceutical to unmetabolized radiopharmaceutical in tissue. And also that there's negligible untrapped radiopharmaceutical in the feature that we're looking at our imaging time point. So how do we use SUV in practice? Well, we wait 60 minutes or more, if it was FDG, to meet these assumptions. We will draw a volume of interest. And within that volume of interest, we can, through our calibrated scanner, calculate the activity concentration in that region of interest, which, if we divide by the amount of activity that we injected into the patient, and also normalize for the body habitus, the size of the patient, we get this term of SUV. So how do we account for the different body sizes of our patients? Well, mostly we would scale according to body weight, but there are other normalizations that we could do, either to lean body mass or body surface area. And knowing that there is no FDG metabolism in fat, we can see how maybe FDG normalized to body weight isn't always the most advantageous, and maybe we should consider going to lean body mass or body surface area in some instances. But as we all know, body weight is normally the way we normalize our SUVs. So as we've said, what we need here to get this SUV is to measure the activity concentration in tissue. We require the scanner to be calibrated to determine the activity concentration from the actual image. So once we've drawn the region of interest around the feature that we're interested in, we can quote the SUV max, the SUV mean, or the SUV peak, and I point you towards the figure on the right here. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of these measures? So the SUV max is the most common and provides the most intense uptake value within our region, but it does rely on a single voxel value and therefore is prone to noise. SUV mean, as its name suggests, is looking at the average value of uptake in a region, but is prone to low values and can be affected by the limited resolution of our systems. So you can imagine, we're never going to get full recovery of the mean uptake because of the tail off when we get to the edges because of the spatial resolution of our systems. An SUV peak, this is a kind of compromise between SUV max and SUV mean. And what we do here is we look at the highest average in a 1 centimeter cubed volume as we move through the volume of interest. There are also other quantitative measures that we can use. Firstly, there is TLG and MTV, which have been defined really for FDG imaging. So TLG, or total lesion glycolysis, looks at the mean SUV in the feature and multiplies this by the size of the feature, its volume. So really what TLG is doing is giving you a metric of the significance of that tumour, that volume. Metabolic tumour volume, or MTV, what happens in this instance is that you define an SUV cutoff so that all features in your image above that SUV are deemed to be features that you're interested in. Of course, you have to go through the image and remove normal visual uptake in areas such as the bladder or the brain, for example. And what you're doing here is if you then sum the volume of tissue that is above this SUV threshold, excluding physiological areas, you get a metric of the disease extent. I said these have really been designed for FDG, but they're also useful with other radiopharmaceuticals as well. So, for example, in bone spect MTV or a version of it, it has been used as a marker of bone metastatic burden. There are also ratio methods that are available to us, such as binding potential, SUVR, tumour to background, tumour to blood. So often these ratio methods are looking at the ratio of specific to non-specific uptake in our image. So, for example, in ioflupane or DAT scan, we look at the binding potential by looking at the specific binding ratios in the striata and then comparing that to a non-specific area, such as the occipital lobe. SUVR is commonly used in brain imaging, in FDG PET and amyloid PET, where you will compare the uptake in various lobes to an unaffected area, which is frequently the cerebellum. And for some radiopharmaceuticals, particular PET radiopharmaceuticals, in oncology, you will look at the tumour to blood ratio or the tumour to background ratio to determine the significance of uptake in the feature you're interested in. And these are related to kinetics and are important parameters. The final quantification output I want to go through, and something that's used quite heavily in neurological imaging, is the Z-score. So what is the Z-score? So what we tend to do is we will take our 3D data set and spatially register it to a standard space, to a template. So we can normalize the counts so the image counts match those provided in the template. So we could normalize to an occipital lobe reference region to make sure that the uptake in our reference region in our scan of interest matches that to what we have in our normal database. So then we look at the relevance of the uptake in terms of the number of standard deviations away from an average. And this number of standard deviations is called the Z-score. So if we look in the image on the right here, we see our image that we're looking at, this ioflupane SPECT scan. We're looking at the specific uptake within the striatal structures, so the caudate, the putamen, and the anterior and posterior putamen. Our non-specific uptake is in the occipital lobe. So we get these ratio measurements, which, as you can see here, is this specific binding ratio. But we can also relate this to an age-related normal database and give a Z-score. So we can see the database actually in reality here with the various points on it, the mean, the two standard deviations, and you can see that for this particular measurement, it sits within the normal range, and this is why the Z-score is less than two standard deviations, where you would normally see a significant difference. I want to talk about databases that we would use to make comparisons. So these databases of healthy, normal individuals. There's some challenges associated with them. One is that ideally the database that you have should ideally match your local population. It should also ideally match the scanning and imaging parameters that you use. But what we often do is actually alter the parameters we use in locally to match those of the parameters used in the database so that we can make a good comparison. As you saw in the last example, some databases will also need to account for age and sometimes gender. And creating these databases can be a challenge because, of course, ethically it's very difficult for us to irradiate a large healthy population. On a population basis, you could argue that it should be done, but it still can be quite difficult to get through approvals. Fortunately, public databases do exist. So for DATScan or IFLUPAIN, there's the ENCDAT database that I was involved in a few years ago with the A&M. There's a PPMI database in the US. And for FDG and amyloid and tau PET, ADNI have public databases of normal individuals. So I've mentioned that ideally you need to match your database to your parameters and to your local population. But actually in practice, anecdotally, the databases do tend to be quite robust to small changes in image parameters and populations. So you'll find they work relatively well with the scanners and their populations that you have locally. Now on to some of the challenges of image quantification. In terms of preparation, we must be aware of things that might interact with our uptake. So we know, for example, with FDG, we've got to get the blood glucose at relatively low levels so that the FDG isn't competing with glucose already circulating in the patient. It's well known as well when we're doing our IFLUPAIN or DATScan imaging that various medications will affect uptake. So it's very important that note is taken about which medications are being taken and whether they can be withdrawn if possible. Another thing that we have to do when we're doing this quantitative imaging, which is more of a burden, I think, in SPECT imaging where it's not routine compared to PET imaging where it is that we need to measure our syringe of radiopharmaceutical before and after injection to understand exactly how much we've administered to the patient. And we also need to synchronize the clocks in the area we're injecting and to the clocks on the scanner so that any time difference between injection and scan is measured accurately. And of course, if we're doing SUV measurements, we need to normalize the activity to the body habitus a little bit. So we need to measure weight generally or also height is another thing we may measure. And the time of imaging, of course, can be really important too. So in the image on the right here, you can see that how our FDG concentration changes in inflammation, and that's why this is malignancy and inflammation over time, so that you can see that if we were imaging at 60 minutes or 90 minutes, the levels of uptake that we measure are going to be quite different. So if you're comparing to what's in the literature, you need to get the time right, or if you're doing longitudinal imaging before and after therapy, it's really important that you try and match the time of imaging to what had been used previously. In terms of data acquisition, we've got to have appropriate sampling. We've got to have the right pixel and voxel size. On older scanners, we may still be able to acquire with 5mm pixel sizes or voxel sizes, where Our spatial resolution is less than that, so we've got to be careful to get the right voxel size or the most appropriate voxel size chosen. Inspect, we've got to make sure we get the appropriate number of angular projections. We've got to be mindful of noise in our data acquisition. What I would say is that good quantification does not always mean good visual image quality. When we start blurring things, we will affect metrics such as SUV max. So filtering's not always great. And if we're drawing a volume of interest, then even though the image might look noisy, of course, we're averaging the uptake in those particular volumes, or we can average uptake in those particular volumes, which can overcome some of our noise limitations. Reconstruction is something else we need to address in quantitative PECT and SPECT imaging. The default settings for iterative reconstruction focus on good-looking images rather than accurate images. And for quantification, we should really aim for convergence when we do our iterative reconstruction. So if I just show you this example here, you can see that this is showing the results from quantification of DAT-scan imaging that I did a number of years ago. So this is our true accurate value of uptake that we should be getting. And you can see that if we're doing 40 or 50 iterations, so that might be like 2 iterations, 25 subsets, for example, you can see that we're only getting between 85 and 95% of the true volume, the true quantitative measure. So convergence is also dependent on the activity and the environment that we're working in. So if we just look at this figure from Johann Neutz from a few years ago now, where he was looking at doing iterative reconstruction, and he just did 2 point sources, one surrounded by nothing and the second source surrounded by some background, you can see that you converge, you get the more accurate answer quite quickly with iterative reconstruction when the source is not surrounded by anything, but when you have surrounding activity, it takes longer to get to the true answer. But we also know that when we do more iterations, we do get noisier data, which is a challenge. And how you deal with that, we touched on a little bit before. Filtering can help, but can affect quantitative accuracy. Maybe we average across this volume of interest, which can help us a bit too. And in PET, obviously, but also in SPECT now, we are getting these new reconstruction algorithms that help get convergence and help control noise, such as Q-Clear, which you can get on General Electric scanners. As for reconstruction corrections, we need to apply all of these. We apply attenuation correction, but some of the challenges we might get here is if there's some misregistration through voluntary or involuntary motion. And also we can get problems if there's metal within or contrast within the CT, because it affects the attenuation correction values we apply to the PET and SPECT. In terms of scatter correction, some of you may have seen in PET, if you're imaging with PSMA, you can get these halo artifacts or areas of zero counts surrounding very high uptake areas, which are a challenge or a failure of the scatter correction. The softwares are getting better now, and the manufacturers are getting better now at dealing with these, but you can still see them. In SPECT, when we do scatter correction, it's often using multiple energy window scatter correction. But what happens when you use this is you increase the noise, so there's challenges there. And similarly, sometimes the scatter correction also takes information from the CT, which if it contains metal or contrast can give you challenges. And the final correction I want to bring up here is resolution modeling. So this is something you get in PET, PSF modeling. It's also known as, you get it in PET and in SPECT imaging. The challenge you get with this resolution modeling is that you can start recovering more than 100% of the true activity. And for larger features, you can get cold centers, which are purely a consequence of the reconstruction and not anything to do with the uptake in the feature that you're looking at. So if I just show you this example here, it's a SPECT example that we published in an IEA document a few years back. So the just get my pointer. If we look at the image on the left here, this is with resolution modeling. This is without resolution modeling. So I'd like to draw your attention to the largest sphere here in the phantom, where you can see it seems to have a cold center when you use resolution modeling. Without resolution modeling, it's pretty uniform. There is no cold center. You can also see for this smaller feature that it seems to be a lot clearer with resolution modeling than without. And if we look at the profiles, you can see that both those things quite clearly. So you can see the high overestimation of the smaller feature, and you can also see the cold center in the larger object. To avoid noise, we can filter our imaging, and the temptation is to use filtering to assist clinical viewing, and I think that's okay. But if we apply filtering, remember we will reduce uptake, particularly in smaller lesions. As we've said previously, quantification is often in a volume, which allows averaging over the volume to try and help avoid noise effects to some extent. And again, as I've said previously, a quantitative image may not be a pretty image, but we may still need to get a pretty image to define the volumes of interest. If we have a noisy image, it can be quite challenging to define volumes of interest. So how do we define the volumes of interest? We can define it on CT or SPECT or PET. We know that CT obviously has better spatial resolution than PET and SPECT, but the challenge is whether the anatomical volume we see on CT matches that we have metabolically on SPECT and PET. Sometimes that will not be the case. We can ask our nuclear medicine physicians and radiologists to manually delineate the area we're interested in, but we know that that comes with variability across operators. And we also know, depending on how the colour scale is set, we can get quite different results, so we have to be mindful of that too. There are algorithms available on many of our software that we have available to us. Most of these rely on the percentage of the maximum uptake in the area we're interested in. Some will also account for background, which is important sometimes. And there are other algorithms as well out there. There's a fuzzy logic algorithm from Matthew Hatch, 2009, which is quite interesting. And of course, now there are a number of artificial intelligence algorithms out there which will help us define our volumes of interest. Just be mindful about the voxel size. I mentioned this a bit before. If you have large voxels on small features, you can quite easily have problems defining volumes of interest based on SPECT and PET data. While we're talking about spatial resolution, I want to come on to the final challenge we have with quantification, and that is partial volume effects and how we can overcome this using partial volume correction. So it's known that any structure with a diameter of less than 2.5 times the spatial resolution of our imaging system will be affected. So if we're looking at small features, the uptake we measure will be reduced. It won't be the true value. It'll be less than what it should be. And we know the amount of uptake that we measure is dependent on the object shape and the object contrast. But we can correct for this. One of the simplest ways is if we assume that our feature is a sphere, what we can do is measure the diameter and then look at a table to see what signal loss we would get from that size of feature. So let me show you an example here. So here's a phantom that we've acquired. This is a NEMA image quality phantom. You can see in this term, we've looking at the recovery coefficient of the peak uptake in each of these spheres. We get 100% in the larger sphere, but as we get to smaller and smaller spheres, the uptake will be reduced. So what we can then do is, if we know the diameter of our feature, we can go along and then look to see what the uptake is in terms of this peak measure and account for that. So if we're only measuring 50% of the true uptake for this size of feature, we can then correct for that. This type of approach is mostly used as a research tool, but there are a number of other methods out there, and I'd like to point you to this paper by one of my team a few years ago if you want to look at how to correct for measuring the partial volume effect and how to correct for it. So there are a number of challenges, and I just want to put an advert out for harmonization, because if we harmonize what we do across sites, across centers, we can help at least get consistency in the quantification across our sites. So why do we need this harmonization? Well, we've just seen that quantitative values that we get from images can be affected by so many factors, be them patient, acquisition, processing, and analysis factors. So with harmonization, what we can do is we can get the SUV I measure on my scanner closer to the SUV you measure on your scanner, or if we were looking at the symmetry, the dose that I measure to be closer to the dose that you measure. So we can take out some of these technical factors. And there are a number of harmonization bodies out there at the moment which will help you do this. Of course, in Europe, we have the EANM's EARL initiative. In the US, there's the Society of Nuclear Medicine and Molecular Imaging Clinical Trials Network. Australia have ARTNet, and there are other organizations out there such as KIBA as well. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.